what would you discover if you drove deep into the wooded hills of West Virginia, following a narrowing road where the trees crowd in so tightly, it feels as if the map itself refuses to guide you further? And what if at the end of that forgotten path, there stood a house, a place the world was never meant to see? Tonight, we open the ledger on one of the most unsettling families ever captured on film, the Whittakers of Odd, West Virginia. For generations, they lived in silence, hidden from history, their existence known only to neighbors who kept their distance. Then, in the early 2000s, a photographer knocked at their door, and the silence broke not with words, but with barking. Years later, when the footage finally surfaced online, millions found themselves unable to look away. What they witnessed was not performance, not rumor, but reality. A family living at the uneasy intersection of poverty, isolation, and whispered ancestry. Some called it exploitation, others called it necessary exposure. Yet the truth of who the Whittakers are remains unsettled, hovering between rumor and record. Before we begin, welcome to Gothic Ledger. Share with us in the comments where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. And if forgotten histories, unsettling mysteries, and stories left out of official records are what draw you in, be sure to like this video and subscribe. Because what follows tonight is not folklore nor invention. It is the chronicle of a family still living in Odd, still walking the same narrow road, and still embodying a mystery no camera has ever fully explained. In the hills of southern West Virginia lies a settlement with a name that feels almost too fitting. Odd. Not a town in the usual sense, but an unincorporated hollow, tucked away in Raleigh County, along a road so narrow, the forest seems to fold inward upon it, while a shallow creek slices the land into silence. For most of its existence, Odd did not appear on maps that mattered. It was known only to those who lived in its hollows, a scattering of homes that felt less like they were built than simply left behind. Coal once gave Raleigh County its shape. Mines bored through mountains, carving out both livelihoods and dependence. But when the veins thinned and the work dried up, poverty settled across the land like a permanent fog. Families who stayed after industry's collapse learned to live in the shadow of absence of work, of opportunity, and of recognition from the wider world. Odd became little more than a name on a weathered signpost, uttered by postal clerks and almost no one else. The land itself reinforced the separation. Narrow ridges and steep wooded slopes discouraged visitors. Homes stood at irregular intervals, some hidden behind tangles of brush, others perched above deep gullies. Silence was not an interruption here, it was the rule broken only by the occasional passing of a truck or the rush of water after heavy rains. For those who lived within the outside world, often felt as distant as another century. Odd's anonymity persisted through the 20th century. Census takers tallied numbers, but no story ever pushed beyond the county line. Even in Raleigh County, with its long history of strikes, disasters and migration, Odd remained a footnote. Few people came in and fewer still left with anything worth repeating. To most of West Virginia, it was just another forgotten hollow, indistinguishable from the dozens scattered across the Appalachian interior. That obscurity lasted until the early years of the 21st century. In 2004, photographer Mark Leiter steered his vehicle down Tommy Creek Road, approaching a modest home that would one day be recognized by millions. The moment passed quietly, at first greeted with suspicion, then retreat. No one at the time could have imagined that this small encounter would mark the beginning of Odd's unraveling anonymity. For centuries, isolation had been Odd's protection. It preserved its families, its rhythms, its secrecy. But in the 21st century, obscurity was no longer guaranteed. The internet had begun dissolving borders of distance and anonymity. What could once remain buried in the hills was suddenly at risk of exposure to the entire world. Odd had always lived up to its name, too small to claim a civic identity, too remote to invite intrusion. But this very invisibility is what made what followed so jarring. A hollow once silent, a family once undisturbed, would soon stand at the center of one of the strangest spectacles of the digital age. The first approach was not welcomed. It was answered by barking. In 2004, long before the Whittakers became a name whispered across the internet, Mark Later turned his car onto Tommy Creek Road and found himself before a home that history had nearly overlooked. The lane itself was unremarkable, winding through Raleigh County's Appalachian thickets like so many forgotten roads. But it led to a home that had long been spoken of in whispers. Mark Later had come searching for hidden America, documenting lives left outside the gaze of cities and highways. In Odd, he found not just isolation but resistance. The house was small and weathered, set back from the road. Nothing about it seemed extraordinary at first glance. Its siding was streaked by rain, its yard scattered with objects too broken to use, yet too useful to discard. Still, its silence carried a weight, as though the walls themselves withheld a story they would not tell. Later approached with the simple intent of introduction, never suspecting that his footsteps would stir something far older than curiosity. From inside, the first reply was not a voice, not even a human word. It was sound raw and guttural, closer to animal than speech, sharp barks noises that seemed instinctive rather than performed. The outburst rose against him like a wall unmistakably defensive. He froze, caught between the impulse to explain himself and the realization that no explanation was wanted. The threshold was not an entrance, but a barrier. Suspicion clung to the august air. The windows reflected nothing but glare. Movement flickered just beyond sight, shadows suggesting life close at hand, but refusing to reveal itself. No one emerged. The barking only continued, layered with muffled grunts, indistinct shouts, communication without clarity. In that moment, Later was not a visitor. He was an intruder. The hollow had declared its boundary. He withdrew unsettled, yet strangely compelled. There was nothing to film, no words exchanged, no images captured. Yet the absence itself felt remarkable. Families in Appalachia often held tight to privacy, but this was different, not shyness, but defense. It was as if language itself had collapsed at the doorway, replaced by signals of warning. The experience lingered long after he left Tommy Creek. He would return years later, this time with persistence and a camera eventually breaking through the silence that had first rejected him. But the memory of that first knock endured a moment when Odd lived up to its name, and when a house revealed its strangeness, not by opening but by closing itself off. For the Whittakers, the intrusion was nothing new. Outsiders had passed before, curious but unwelcome. Their response was not meant as spectacle, it was survival. For generations, Odd belonged to those who stayed, not those who came looking. To set foot on that porch was to trespass into a world that owed nothing to the outside. The world would later know their faces, their gestures, even their silences. But in 2004, all that was known was the refusal, the barking, the unseen movements, the unspoken command to leave. What waited behind those doors was not forgotten. It was only waiting. When the footage finally emerged, the world could not turn away. In 2020, a video appeared on a channel called Soft White Underbelly. Its title was stark. Its subject seemed unassuming. Inbred family, the Whittakers. Within hours it spread. Within days it reached millions. What had once been a hollow hidden in Raleigh County was suddenly projected onto screens in every corner of the globe. The camera lingered on a family that had lived largely unseen. Faces filled the frame: Betty's stillness, Lorraine's cautious eyes, Ray's guttural calls that unsettled and fascinated at once. Nothing about the setting was staged. The clutter of the yard, the dim interior, the rhythms of a household ordinary and estranged all at once. And it was precisely this unfiltered reality that struck viewers. They were not watching actors, not participants in some staged production, but people who had existed in obscurity until this sudden unveiling. The reaction was instant and divided. Some viewers watched with curiosity, remarking on the strangeness. Others reacted with shock, repeating every rumor of inbreeding and collapse whispered for decades. A smaller portion responded with empathy, urging compassion for lives marked so deeply by poverty and isolation. But whether in fascination, judgment, or pity, one thing united all who watched: no one could look away. As view counts surged into the millions, the Whittakers' image hardened into symbol. Their silence became spectacle. Their gestures, their expressions, their noises replayed endlessly across forums and feeds. Strangers dissected every clip, every pause, every glance, analyzing a family they had never met in a place they had never set foot. The Whittakers' home was no longer a secluded dwelling along Tommy Creek. It had become something else entirely, the stage for one of the internet's most viral studies in human otherness. The anonymity that had sheltered the family for generations dissolved almost overnight. Odd, once a name invisible to all but the people who lived there, became a place strangers now searched on maps. The Whittakers, once known only to neighbors and the occasional passerby, suddenly became names spoken across continents. Their hollow had been breached, not by footsteps on their porch, but by the boundless reach of digital exposure. The video's impact cannot be measured in views alone. It reshaped perceptions of what Appalachia could signify. No longer just the shorthand of coal mine strikes and decline. It became a landscape of hidden genealogies, secrets preserved in silence, and lives shaped in the shadows beyond the gaze of institutions. In an instant, the Whittakers were lifted from obscurity into a narrative they did not create and could not control, a narrative authored in comment sections and forums, written in the imagination of a global audience. What began as a portrait quickly grew into a phenomenon, but within that phenomenon lay distortion. The footage offered presence but not context, gestures but no history. The family became emblematic in ways that were reductive symbols of inbreeding, of poverty, of Appalachian isolation. Labels pressed upon them from the outside, none of them complete. The world saw their image, but not their truth. What the lens revealed was striking, but what it concealed was even more important. The footage released in 2020 presented the Whittakers not through charts or genealogical diagrams, but through the simplest, rawest observations. The way they sat, the way they moved, the sounds they made instead of words. Within those frames, they were not case studies but presences fixed within their own routines. Ray became, for many, the most haunting figure. He did not speak in sentences. His voice came as guttural barks and sharp grunts, sounds that felt less chosen than instinctive. Yet his communication was unmistakably intentional, often accompanied by pointed gestures, expressive, directed, and oddly precise, even if it resisted translation. To viewers, he appeared both open and closed, at once unreachable by words, yet unguarded in sound. The camera lingered on him longer than the others, not because he explained himself, but precisely because he could not. Beside him, Betty often sat in stillness. She seemed to embody endurance, her presence marked not by motion but by the quiet absence of it. Years of being seen and unseen appeared to rest on her like a settled weight. When she did respond to the lens, her words were measured, subdued, neither welcoming nor rejecting. She became the anchor of the family's visual record, a figure of quiet resignation. Lorraine appeared differently. Her gaze moved quickly, scanning with unease. Her eyes betrayed a sharp awareness of intrusion, as if she felt the camera's presence more acutely than the others. She seemed both present and withdrawn, offering fragments of herself, but never yielding a whole picture. In her manner, the footage captured the very tension of being forced into visibility against one's will. These three figures, Ray's sounds, Betty's stillness, Lorraine's guarded eyes formed the core of what millions consumed. Yet in all of it, no explanation was given. The footage recorded behaviors, not causes. No medical names were spoken, no diagnosis offered, no genealogical chart displayed. The family was presented without classification, without commentary, only as they were. That silence was striking. Their traits were not framed within the language of genetics or psychology. They were left unclassified, ambiguous. And it was this ambiguity that ignited the strongest reactions. Fascination, pity, judgment, outrage, all projected onto lives that gave no definition of themselves. The footage became a mirror, reflecting not only the Whittakers, but also the assumptions of those who watched. Some viewers saw disability, others saw inbreeding, others saw poverty alone. But none of these interpretations came from the family. They were never asked to define themselves, never given the words to match what outsiders demanded to name. Their reality remained theirs alone, unspoken, unresolved. The record was paradoxical, vivid in image, yet void of explanation. The Whittakers were seen in extraordinary detail, yet their essence remained untouched, concealed in the very absence of words. Their lives were recorded, but their condition was never written down. Some say the tree had grown too close to itself, and when their story spread across the internet in 2020, the most persistent explanation offered by outsiders was the simplest and perhaps the most brutal, a story of lineage. The claim repeated in tabloids and whispered through online forums was that the Whittakers' parents had been cousins, sometimes specified as double first cousins, a union where two branches of a family fold tightly back upon themselves. It was this compression, so the story went, that produced the traits captured in the footage, now dissected by millions. But such statements remain what they have always been claims. No verified genealogical record has ever surfaced to prove or disprove them. The census rolls of Raleigh County list names and numbers, but they do not map private unions or unspoken ties within the hollows. Birth certificates are locked away inaccessible. The family itself has provided no documentation. What circulates instead are rumors repeated often enough that conjecture begins to masquerade as truth. The phrase double first cousins carries an unsettling resonance. In genealogical terms, it collapses the very categories that keep kin, distinct cousin, becoming sibling uncle, blurring into nephew. A tree that should spread outward instead loops inward, turning upon itself. For many viewers, this phrase became a ready-made lens through which to read the Whittakers, a family whose branches bent inward as much as their geography kept them apart. But in the absence of proof, such interpretations reflect outsiders as much as they do the family. The hunger for explanation. Why does Ray bark? Why do Betty and Lorraine seem as they do? Found satisfaction not in records but in rumor. Isolation was equated with inbreeding. Silence was taken as evidence of collapse. What could not be verified was consumed anyway because it offered a story that felt whole. This is the danger of compression as narrative. Once suggested, it requires little evidence to sustain itself. It reduces complexity into formula, the mystery explained by a single phrase. But without documents, without testimony, the claim remains a shadow projected upon the Whittakers from beyond odd. No public record confirms cousin marriages in the immediate generation. No certified genealogy has mapped the exact lines that might converge. The compression may be real or it may be exaggerated, amplified by the fascination with taboo. Between fact and speculation lies a gap. And in that gap, the Whittakers endure. For centuries, Appalachian families have lived under the weight of suspicion, their genealogies scrutinized through a cultural lens more than a biological one. To attach the same suspicion to the Whittakers is to extend an old narrative, one rooted as much in stereotype as in science. In their case, it is the absence of evidence that fuels the myth, the silence of records that invites others to bend the tree inward. The Whittaker lineage exists. Its branches are real, but whether they fold back upon themselves and how far remains unanswered. What the camera captured in odd was not charts or records, but voices, or in Ray's case, the lack of them. Of all the family, it was Ray who became most etched into memory. His eyes darting, body-restless throat, erupting in sharp barks and guttural sounds, he communicated in a manner entirely his own. Where Betty answered with stillness, where Lorraine guarded herself with wary glances, Ray expressed himself through a vocabulary of sound. He did not form sentences. He did not string phrases, yet his presence carried undeniable force. On camera, his bark could sound like warning, his grunt like insistence, his sharp exhalations like punctuation to gestures. A pointed finger, a shuffle in the dirt, a sudden turn of his head. To outsiders, they seemed indecipherable, almost animal. But within the family, they were treated as ordinary, understood without confusion. His siblings responded without hesitation, as though his barks were as clear to them as spoken words long rehearsed. For viewers around the world, this became haunting. Millions replayed the moments where Ray seemed to collapse the boundary between human and animal. To some, it was disturbing. To others, it became proof of the story of genetic collapse. To many, it hardened into the single image that defined the family. Yet within the Whittakers' hollow, Ray was not spectacle, he was kin. His sounds were not aberration but the natural vocabulary of their daily life. The fascination with Ray reveals less about him than it does about the gaze that watched him. Silence unsettles, especially when it comes from one expected to speak. Into that silence, viewers projected meanings, tragedy, otherness, mystery. But the footage itself gave no explanation. There were no diagnoses, no scientific accounts, no authoritative interpretation. Only Ray sounding in his own register and the world listening without comprehension. That incomprehension became the aura around him. His sealed communication was reduced to shorthand, the one who barked. In comments and discussions, his guttural voice was repeated as proof of all that had been whispered about the Whittakers' ancestry. Yet what such repetitions missed was that Ray was never silent. He was speaking in a language of his own, one simply closed to outsiders. In the archival sense, his presence shows how communication itself can become a border. Words allow entry, they admit outsiders. Sound without words resists intrusion. In this way, Ray became both the most visible and the most unreachable of the Whittakers. The camera held him more vividly than anyone else, yet revealed less. His language closed as much as it opened. It is fitting then that Ray became the enduring symbol of the family online, not because he explained them, but precisely because he did not. His voice, if voice it can be called, embodied the tension between exposure and concealment at the core of the Whittaker story. The world heard him, yet could not understand him. For some, his silence spoke louder than speech. A trip to Walmart became an international spectacle. When Mark Leiter returned to Odd after the first viral release, his lens did not seek only interviews or portraits. It followed the Whittakers through daily rhythms, preparing meals, buying groceries, trimming hair. Acts that elsewhere would pass without remark became under the gaze uncanny rituals replayed by millions. The ordinary, once invisible, was transformed into event. One sequence showed the family at breakfast. Plates, filled cups lifted, a rhythm of eating unfolded in quiet. Yet beneath the lens, every gesture thickened with meaning. Viewers remarked on pauses, on the stillness, on the absence of words. A meal that should have been unremarkable became commentary proof for some of strangeness, for others of rumor, and for still others a portrait of endurance. What in most homes vanishes into routine was consumed globally as content. Another sequence followed a trip to Walmart. Fluorescent aisles, ordinary shelves, mundane transactions, yet to an audience primed by earlier footage. It was more than shopping. It was a rare glimpse of the family in public, navigating a world from which they had long been apart. For viewers, the familiar store became estranged, an uncanny stage where distance and intimacy collided. Even grooming a haircut, a shave was recorded and replayed. The snip of scissors, the buzz of clippers, the reveal of a face beneath overgrowth. What would elsewhere be private maintenance became public theatre. Strangers speculated as though hair removed might uncover hidden truth. The uncanny arose not from what the family did, but from the gaze placed upon them. Breakfast shopping, grooming none extraordinary in themselves, were recast through the frame of isolation and whispered ancestry. The ordinary became symptom. Silence at a table was read as pathology. Awkwardness in a store was read as proof of disconnection. In this way, daily life was turned into spectacle. Archival detachment reveals how survival's rituals, meals, supplies, maintenance can be stripped of neutrality once exposed to outside eyes. What sustains life became entertainment. The family did not alter their routines. The routines themselves were altered by their status as content. This transformation raises a larger question about the act of watching. When the world peers into the ordinary lives of those once hidden, what is revealed? Do we learn of the family or of ourselves, our appetite for otherness, our hunger to locate the uncanny in the mundane? For the Whittakers, life continued as before. Bread was eaten, groceries purchased, hair trimmed. But for millions, these fragments became charged with meaning, read as proof of something beyond routine. Nothing about daily bread should unsettle, yet it did. With visibility came not only fascination but charity and expectation. As the Whittakers' story spread, parcels of clothing, boxes of food, envelopes of money began arriving through the same channels that had carried rumor. A GoFundMe account was established, drawing contributions from strangers who had never set foot in West Virginia but felt compelled to intervene. Fascination became support resources crossing distance. Mark Leiter, the photographer who first brought their lives into view, announced that every cent minus taxes and fees was delivered directly to the family. He became the conduit between audience and subject, recording their lives, then relaying the generosity that attention produced. In his telling, the arrangement was simple. The world had not only watched, it had given. Parcels payments and promises of care crossed borders and distances, landing in the fragile orbit of the Whittakers. Yet within this strange chain of generosity, new questions surfaced. Viewers debated whether such charity truly served the family or merely sustained the filmmaker's lens. Some whispered of exploitation, others insisted it was a lifeline. Every donation carried with it more than currency. It bore judgment. Who had chosen to give, why they had given, and what might be done with the offering lingered unspoken but heavy. For the Whittakers, these gifts were not symbols but sustenance. Food was consumed, clothing, worn money, quietly spent. To them, survival required no justification. Yet once acceptance was shown on camera, expectation followed close behind. The internet, having offered aid, demanded its return in gratitude, in proof of improvement, in visible transformation. What had been given freely was weighed again and again, as though kindness could only be validated by measurable change. Generosity, once simple, became ledger and account book with no final balance. The family's existence, once shadowed in no invisibility, had now been tethered to the bright, unblinking eye of the camera. Their survival became entangled with visibility itself. With each new upload, more support arrived. With each new gift, more suspicion spread. Charity became obligation, and obligation soon became burden. Looking back, the fragility of such dependence becomes plain. Unlike wages, charity is unstable. Fragile as glass, built not on labor, but on the shifting winds of attention. A GoFundMe page is as much performance as plea its outcome, determined by how long strangers care to watch. For the Whittakers, attention was paradox. It sustained them even as it imperiled them. No balance sheet can capture such an exchange. They had received food, clothing, shelter in moments of need. The world in return had received content, mystery, and the strange satisfaction of participation. Yet, the ledger remains incomplete, for how could one calculate the weight of expectation, the silent toll of being known, the cost of living under a gaze that never quite looked away? Charity saved, but it also bound. It gave with one hand and circled chains with the other. And so, the question lingered unresolved had the camera delivered the Whittakers from oblivion, or had it trapped them inside an endless loop of giving and watching, of pity and doubt? In December 2023, the question deepened into calamity. The Whittaker home, a mobile dwelling already marked by fragility, was overtaken by fire. Sudden, consuming, merciless, the flames swept through thin walls and hollow framing. What little the family possessed, gathered over years of poverty and supplemented by charity, was reduced to ash. Gifts from strangers, clothing, and small comforts once held as symbols of kindness vanished in smoke, erasing the ledger of survival that had stretched across years of exposure. News of the blaze traveled outward not through official reports, but through the same channel that had first made the family known video. The scorched ruin appeared online, shared, and reshared another chapter written in public view. The audience that had watched their meals, their errands, their daily strangeness was drawn back this time to witness loss itself. Donations followed quickly. Another fundraiser rose from the ashes, another plea extended into the same networks that had once blurred their reality into spectacle. Reactions too followed familiar patterns. Some voices swelled with sympathy, insisting no family, no matter how unusual or misunderstood, should face such devastation alone. Others, hardened by suspicion, muttered of cycles repeating, doubting need of framing tragedy as stagecraft. For some, the fire was catastrophe. For others, it was narrative. The blaze did more than destroy a home. It reignited the debate over what it meant for strangers to watch, to give, and to judge. For the Whittakers themselves, the consequences were immediate and tangible: displacement, the sudden absence of routine, the loss of shelter. Fire stripped away privacy in a way cameras never could. Walls were not only breached, but erased, leaving the family literally exposed. Survival, once bound to charity and daily ritual, now depended on reconstruction. Yet uncertainty lingered. Would rebuilding restore stability, or would the very act of rebuilding invite even deeper scrutiny? In odd houses burn and are rebuilt. Life continues. But for the Whittakers, no event remained local. Each disaster was absorbed into a narrative already shared with the world. The fire became not simply a misfortune, but another chapter in a story that no longer belonged to those living it. Their anonymity, once a fragile defense, had long since been consumed. The fire took their shelter, but it did not extinguish the enduring mystery that kept them subjects of endless speculation. Flames devoured the walls, but not the questions. That mystery deepened in March 2024, when a new video appeared under the soft white underbelly banner. Its title carried an air of finality: The Death of Larry Whittaker. Conditioned to consume the family's hardships, as serialized Chronicle viewers clicked expecting closure for one of Odd's most visible figures. The tone was unequivocal. Larry, it seemed, was gone. Condolences poured in, accompanied by speculation on causes and reflections on what Larry had represented. For some, his death confirmed the inevitable toll of poverty and isolation. For others, it was a sobering reminder that the Whittakers' story was not mere content, but the fragile record of real lives. Yet, certainty unraveled almost immediately. New footage emerged, showing Larry alive, seated, moving, undeniably present. Those who had mourned now felt deceived. Confusion hardened into accusation. Was this fabrication, exaggeration, or simply error? Was Larry's supposed death a symptom of miscommunication or proof that the line between documentary and spectacle had collapsed entirely. The backlash was swift and fierce. Online forums dissected the contradiction, pointing to gaps in narration edits and communication between filmmaker and family. Apologies followed, but they did little to mend the rupture. Once death itself was called into question, every other detail of the Whittaker narrative became suspect. Larry's death became emblematic of a larger instability. If something as definitive as death could be misreported, then what else had been shaped or distorted by the lens? How much of what audiences consumed was reality? And how much was construction assumption or performance archival reflection marks this moment as a fracture? Earlier chapters of exposure had been met with curiosity, even acceptance of mystery. But after Larry's supposed passing, audiences shifted from passive consumption to active doubt. Fascination gave way to interrogation. Trust collapsed. For the Whittakers, the contradiction may have mattered little, perhaps only confusion about what was said in their name. But for the outside world, it symbolized the collapse of certainty itself. The camera, once seen as a window, was now regarded as a filter, perhaps even a trick. In odd, even death seemed uncertain, and the camera was no longer the only intruder. As the Whittakers' story spread, Odd itself became a destination. Strangers who had first encountered the family through glowing screens began to arrive in person, drawn by the same mixture of fascination, pity, and suspicion that had fueled the digital spectacle. The narrow road along Tommy Creek, once the quiet route of locals and delivery trucks, began to see unfamiliar cars idling at its bends. Outsiders, compelled by curiosity or morbid fascination, came to witness with their own eyes what the lens had already revealed. Some arrived under the guise of kindness, bearing food or small gifts. Others came uninvited, stepping into the yard without permission, peering through windows, calling out questions in hopes of a response. What had once been the burden of the digital gaze now stood at the family's threshold. Silence, once theirs to keep, had become a public attraction. The community of Odd felt the strain. Neighbors watched uneasily as strangers trespassed, turning back roads into paths of pilgrimage. Privacy, already fragile in the Appalachian hollows, collapsed under the weight of attention. Reports spread of cars pulling up at night, of knocks on doors that were not their own, of questions no one wished to answer. Odd, long overlooked, had been transformed into spectacle. The paradox deepened what had first drawn the world in was the family's distance and obscurity. Yet those very qualities were eroded by visitors. What was once mythic in its remoteness was made mundane through intrusion, and yet the myth did not dissolve, it multiplied. Each visitor carried away a fragment, a story of what they thought they had seen. Their retellings often embellished, reinforced the legend rather than weakening it. For the family, however, intrusion was more than inconvenience. It confirmed that they no longer owned their lives. What had once been private within the home and hollow was now treated as a possession of the public. Every gesture, every sound, every fleeting glimpse was seized, interpreted, and recirculated beyond their control. The Whittakers could not escape the gaze, whether of the camera or the uninvited stranger. Archival reflection identifies this moment as the threshold where visibility turned invasive. Viral fame rarely stays confined to the digital. It spills outward, mapping itself onto landscapes, transforming ordinary spaces into sites of spectacle. For Odd, intrusion meant The loss of its last protection? The silence of being overlooked. What had preserved the Whittakers for so long was gone, replaced by the steady arrival of the curious. And yet, those trespassers never uncovered what they sought. Visitors left only with impressions, half glimpses, fragments that deepened mystery without resolving it. Each intrusion strengthened the uncertainty that had drawn them in the first place. The family remained unknowable, the hollow strange. Odd itself grew more unsettled. To speak of the Whittakers' mystery is to speak also of the land. Odd lies within Raleigh County, a place first shaped by geology, then by industry, and finally by its absence. Beneath its ridges and valleys run seams of coal-black veins that once promised livelihood to generations. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, towns rose and swelled around the mines, their populations bound to the rhythms of extraction. Communities lived according to the demands of the coal companies, fortunes tethered to what could be drawn from beneath the earth. But the same veins that sustained also ensured decline. By the late 20th century, coal's centrality withered. Mines closed, jobs disappeared, and entire structures of dependency collapsed into vacancy. Where the noise of labor had once filled the valleys, silence spread. Families left for cities, seeking whatever promise factory towns or distant suburbs could offer. Those who stayed behind faced narrowing prospects, caught in landscapes where the economy had vanished. Odd was not exempt. Too small to be named beyond Raleigh County, its fate mirrored the larger arc. Houses stood weathered, half-renovated, sometimes abandoned. Land once cleared for industry grew back to thicket. Roads narrowed and cracked, traveled only by those who still remained. The name Odd seemed to signify more than a place. It described a condition, a survival at the margins of recognition. Appalachia itself has long been marked by narratives of seclusion. Outsiders wrote of hollows as spaces where isolation bred difference, where mountains stood as both fortress and prison. Over time, such portrayals hardened into cultural myths, casting the region as at once impenetrable and exposed, hidden, and yet endlessly scrutinized. The idea of Appalachia has long been framed not merely as rural but as strange, not merely as poor but as insular. Whether rooted in truth or distorted through repetition, these myths shaped the lens through which the world viewed places like Odd. It was from this soil that the Whittakers' story emerged. Their lives, captured in viral footage, cannot be separated from the history of Raleigh County. Poverty, isolation, and the absence of industry were not theirs alone. They were the inheritance of the land itself. To interpret their story without acknowledging the decline around them is to mistake symptom for cause. Archival reflection notes that Odd was already forgotten long before the Whittakers were remembered. Its silence was not personal, but collective, the residue of a region once central to national industry, then discarded. The house on Tommy Creek was one of many dwellings left behind on the margins of progress. What set it apart was not its condition but the fact that a camera turned its way. The Whittakers' mystery belongs not only to them but to Appalachia. It is the mystery of what remains after decline, what forms of life persist in valleys where the sound of work has long since vanished. The family became emblematic, not just of lineage, but of land, its silence, its persistence, its refusal to disappear. The hills had kept secrets long before the Whittakers, and they still do. In this story, absence matters as much as presence. The Whittakers of Odd have been spoken of more than they have been documented. Their lives appear in footage and in fragments of conversation. Yet their paper trail remains elusive. Census records for Raleigh County capture names, ages, and households, but they do not reveal the inner logic of unions or the conditions within closed doors. Marriage certificates are scarce birth records, difficult to trace. And no genealogical archive confirms what is most loudly claimed, that their parents were cousins, even double first cousins. What fills these gaps instead is rumor. Online commentary repeats the phrase inbred family with certainty, though no official record substantiates it. Tabloid reports amplify the claim without offering evidence. Repetition itself has become a record, a substitute ledger, carrying the weight of truth without ever being inscribed. Medical confirmation is equally absent. Viewers project diagnoses interpreting gestures, sounds, and silences as though they were symptoms. Yet no doctor's report has been made public, no medical file tied to their names. The camera shows bodies, but never charts. The absence of such records leaves a vacuum one outsiders are eager to fill with assumption. This absence is itself telling. Appalachia is full of families whose histories are fractured in documentation. Poverty, isolation, and mistrust of institutions meant that births were sometimes unrecorded marriages, informal, and deaths marked only by a cross in the soil. The Whittakers are not an exception. They are part of a regional pattern where silence in the archives is as common as ink. But when their story became global, expectation clashed with reality. The world demanded proof, while the archives yielded only omission. In this collision, every missing certificate became evidence, every absent name treated as concealment. Silence in official records grew louder than any document, feeding the perception of secrecy. Absence in this sense functioned as presence. The missing itself became part of the narrative. Archival reflection, therefore, must treat omission with care. What is undocumented cannot be replaced by conjecture. To state as fact what remains unproven is to cross the line from record into invention. The responsible task is to mark the gap, to acknowledge the silence, and to recognize its weight. The Whittakers' mystery rests as much in what has not been written as in what has been shown. Their genealogy is unproven, their diagnoses unconfirmed. They remain figures of speculation rather than of record, not because they lack history, but because their history has not been preserved in the ledgers outsiders trust. The ledger is blank, yet the silence reads as if inscribed. Who owns a story once it becomes the world's to witness? The Whittakers' sudden visibility raised not only questions of genealogy and poverty, but also of ethics. From the moment millions first encountered the family through soft white underbelly critics asked whether the footage was documentation or exploitation. The debate soon widened beyond Odd, entering a larger discourse on poverty, disability, and the blurred boundary between witness and voyeurism in digital media. For some, the films were acts of testimony, an unflinching record of lives rarely acknowledged. Donations followed aid arrived, and advocates argued that exposure had brought the family resources they might otherwise never have received. In this view, the camera functioned as intervention, converting fascination into support. Others, however, condemned the project as exploitation. They called it poverty porn, a spectacle in which suffering became content and profit. Here the imbalance was clear. The filmmaker gained views, revenue, and recognition, while the family remained in fragile circumstances. To these critics, the Whittakers were not participants but subjects. Their image circulated without any full grasp of what global scrutiny entailed. Vox documented this dispute, noting its complexity. Mark Leiter himself responded that every dollar raised went to the Whittakers, aside from taxes and platform fees. He cast himself not as profiteer, but as intermediary, a conduit carrying support from audience to family. Yet this defense could not resolve the matter, for the critique was not about money alone. It was about power. The imbalance of power was stark. On one side stood millions of viewers, armed with commentary and speculation. On another, the filmmaker shaping narrative through framing, editing, and titling. At the center stood the Whittakers themselves, largely silent, their story told by others. The very traits that made them compelling to outsiders, their seclusion, their difference, their silence were the same traits that left them unable to control how they were seen. This is the core of the ethical ledger. Who gains when private suffering becomes public content? Who loses when anonymity is stripped away? The balance sheet may be tallied in dollars raised and views counted, but it cannot measure dignity, intrusion, or the permanence of images stored on servers that will outlast the family themselves. Archival reflection keeps the ledger open. It records both defense and critique, noting the impossibility of resolution. For some, the films remain evidence of generosity. For others, of exploitation. In truth, they are both a paradox, where aid and intrusion are inseparable, where rescue and violation occur in the same gesture. When the cameras leave, odd remains. The hollow endures. The trees still bend over Tommy Creek, and the repaired house still shelters its inhabitants. The Whittakers continue to wake, eat, walk, and live as they always have. Yet around them now hovers a shadow larger than their lives, the story told in millions of views, repeated across platforms, debated by strangers who will never set foot in Raleigh County. Their survival persists, though its meaning is endlessly interpreted by others. To some, they are victims of circumstance. To others, relics of lineage collapse. To still others, symbols of rural endurance. None of these interpretations is complete. What is clear is only this: the Whittakers remain. Odd persists. Despite its name recognized worldwide, it is still bypassed on maps overlooked by the state. The road is still narrow. The houses scattered, the silence intact. For locals, life goes on as before. For the outside world, Odd exists as image more than place, a name bound to mystery rather than geography. Ambiguity is what lingers. The videos offered visibility but not comprehension. Genealogical claims remain unverified, medical explanations absent, the family's inner life withheld. Viewers can replay footage endlessly, but repetition does not resolve. Each viewing deepens the sense of something missing. Myth, in turn, outpaces fact. The Whittakers are no longer only a family in a hollow. They are an emblem carried into conversations about Appalachia poverty, inbreeding exploitation and voyeurism. Their image circulates as cultural artifact, distorted, debated, and never settled. And yet, the family remains as they were seated in their yard, walking their road, inhabiting a life the outside world will never fully enter. Archival reflection closes not with resolution but with suspension. The Whittakers have not vanished. Odd has not disappeared. What endures is the uneasy coexistence of survival and speculation. Their truth lies in the liminal space between what the camera captured and what it could not. The story does not end in answer, but in presence. The hills still hold their silence. The family still inhabits their home. The mystery persists, unsettling all who approach it. To speak of them in the past tense would be false. To claim full understanding would be presumptuous. The record remains incomplete and will likely remain so. Odd did not vanish when the cameras departed. It only grew stranger in their absence.